My name is Clara Bennett, 27 years old, once the pride of a quiet little town in Idaho, until the day I came home after graduating from Harvard. That night, during our first family dinner after 6 years apart, I planned to share my good news, the new job offer, the engagement, the life I was finally building. But the moment I stepped through the door, and they saw my stomach, everything collapsed. My father slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "You are a disgrace to the Bennett name." My mother didn't yell, she just said coldly, "You chose failure, so live with it." I left that house with a single suitcase and my law degree in hand, never imagining that just a week later, they'd be on their knees, begging for forgiveness once they found out who the father of the baby really was. Have you ever been rejected by your own family just because you refused to live by their rules? Tell me your story and where you're watching this from in the comments below. Thank you, truly. I grew up in Boise, Idaho, a small town quiet enough to hear the church bells echo every Sunday morning, and small enough that rumors traveled faster than the wind. My family wasn't poor, but we weren't rich either. Still, my father behaved as if we were the center of the universe. He was the HR manager at Kingston & Co., a major construction firm in the region, and my mother worked as an accountant at the local high school. To them, reputation wasn't just important, it was sacred. Every dinner was a roll call of social status, who just got promoted, who divorced, who was kicked out of the church, and most of all how the Bennetts looked in other people's eyes. I learned their silent language early. The subtle glance when I laughed too loud at a church picnic. The long inhale when I wore jeans instead of a skirt. Each gesture was a quiet warning. Appearance matters more than emotion. I had an older brother, Evan, 4 years my senior, and the pride of our entire family line. He became a neurosurgeon, landing on the front page of the Boise Chronicle at just 28. Whenever my father introduced him, he did so with the triumphant tone of a man who believed he had held the scalpel in the operating room. And me? I was just the smart daughter worth bragging about. Every certificate I brought home was framed and hung neatly along the hallway, not because they cherished it, but because it was a proof to the neighbors that we raised our children well. During those years, I learned to wear a smile like a mask, to stay quiet, to keep the peace, and to never ever disappoint anyone, even if it meant watching myself fall apart inside. My father had a habit of comparing. Whenever I got an A, he'd shrug and say, "Evan got an A+. When I made the state debate team, he'd remark, "Evan saves lives, Clara, you just talk." At first, I tried harder, believing that if I just achieved something big enough, he'd finally look at me the way he looked at Evan. But I came to realize that the bar didn't exist. He kept moving it farther, higher, ensuring I'd never reach it. And my mother, the gentle, smiling woman everyone in town adored, was the one who taught me the terror of shame. She never raised her voice. Her words were soft, steady, and sharp as a blade. "You've embarrassed the family, Clara." A sentence so light, yet heavy enough to keep me awake for nights. My childhood was a marathon for approval. While other kids in the neighborhood were praised for singing or drawing, I was taught that a person's worth depended on what could be proudly announced at Christmas dinner. I can't even recall the last time my parents hugged me. Maybe it was the day I got into Harvard, but even then, it wasn't affection. It was victory. Their victory. In that moment, I understood that their love always came with fine print. I had to earn it to deserve it. Boise taught me one thing: the fear of being talked about can make people cruel. I once watched my mother turn down an invitation from a newly divorced neighbor because, as she whispered, "People will say I'm associating with failure." I'd seen my father humiliate a young secretary in front of the entire office, just to prove he was in control. And I understood then, if I ever made a mistake, they'd do the same to me. They would always choose appearances over their own child. I just never thought it would happen so soon. Harvard was unlike anywhere I had ever known. Cambridge in autumn looked like a living painting, crimson leaves drifting down onto brick sidewalks, the air crisp with the scent of roasted coffee spilling from narrow cafes. Every morning, I walked beneath the red brick gate engraved with Veritas, carrying a fragile mix of pride and fear. I had escaped Boise, escaped that suffocating circle of performative virtue, and arrived in a place where people spoke of ideas, law, ethics, and justice. But inside me, something still ached, the relentless need to prove I was worthy. I joined every project, volunteered for extra work, and became a teaching assistant for the Corporate Law Reform Program, a research initiative on legal accountability in corporations. That's where I met the man who changed everything. Miles Kingston. He walked into our first seminar looking as if he'd stepped out of a magazine ad, immaculate suit, calm confidence, but his eyes were different. There was no trace of arrogance, none of that entitlement that usually came with wealth. When the professor introduced him as the program's sponsoring advisor, a few students whispered, "Kingston, as in Kingston and Co.?" My heart stopped for a second. That was the Kingston, the construction company where my father worked. I remember lowering my gaze slightly, praying he wouldn't recognize the name Bennett. But Miles was different. After class, he walked over to me and said, "Miss Bennett, right? Your analysis on corporate ethics was brilliant." I looked up, startled. No one had ever noticed me like that before, not for my ideas, not for my voice. He spoke gently, with that habit of tilting his head slightly when he listened, and he never interrupted. For the first time, I met a man who made me feel heard, not judged. Over the following months, we worked together on a labor rights project. I saw him leave boardroom meetings filled with executives to sit down with construction workers and talk about fair wages. I saw him debate professors calmly, never once using the Kingston name as a shield. When I asked him why, he smiled. "A last name is just inheritance. I'm trying to build value of my own." Maybe that was what struck something deep inside me, that same hunger to escape the shadow of family expectations. What we had didn't happen with a declaration or a confession. It grew quietly through late nights in the library until the lights went out, phone calls that stretched past 3 a.m., and those fleeting glances across crowded hallways. The first time he held my hand, in a small cafe near Harvard Yard, I didn't feel nervous, I felt safe. He said softly, "I know what you're afraid of, that people will think you're with me because of my last name." I laughed and told him the truth. What scared me more was that my father might find out. I never lied to him about my past. I told him about Boise, about my parents, about how they worshipped appearances like a religion. He listened without interrupting, then finally said, "You're not them, Clara. You don't have to live your life apologizing for their choices." It was the first time in my life I'd ever heard those words and believed them. We kept our relationship secret for 2 years. At Harvard, everyone knew Miles Kingston as brilliant and compassionate, but at home, I only said I had a good classmate I worked with on projects. I was terrified my father might try to exploit the connection or, worse, turn my love into another trophy for the Bennett family's display shelf. That fear haunted me so deeply that every time I flew home to Boise for the holidays, I deleted every photo of us from my phone as if I were hiding a shameful secret. Then, in my 3rd year, my life changed in the most unexpected way. I found out I was pregnant. I still remember that morning vividly, sunlight spilling through the small apartment window, the pink lines on the test clear and undeniable. I stood there for minutes, frozen, feeling equal parts fear and serenity. Maybe because, for the first time in so long, I didn't feel alone. When I told Miles, he was silent for 3 seconds, then pulled me into his arms. "Aren't you scared?" I whispered. He shook his head. "No, I'm only scared you'll think this is a mistake." We talked the whole night. He wanted to get married immediately, said his parents would be thrilled. I wasn't surprised. The Kingstons were known for their generosity and long-standing community work. But I hesitated. I didn't want anyone to think I was climbing up. I wanted my parents to know first, to understand that what I had with Miles was real, that this baby wasn't a burden or a scandal, but the most beautiful thing that had ever happened to me. Miles took my hand and said gently, "If you want to tell them first, I'll wait. But remember, I'll be right here whenever you need me." In the months that followed, I tried to hide my growing belly under long coats. I still attended classes, still worked on research, but inside me was a storm I couldn't quiet. I was terrified my parents would reject me, terrified they'd find out before I was ready, terrified of standing before them and seeing that familiar look of contempt in their eyes. And yet, amid all that fear, there were moments of quiet joy hearing the baby's heartbeat for the first time, watching Miles bring home stacks of books about parenting and newborn care. By graduation, I was 5 months along. The long black gown covered most of my stomach, and only a few close friends knew my secret. Miles sat in the audience that day, smiling with pride as I received my diploma. After the ceremony, he gave me a bracelet engraved with the words, "For everything they said you couldn't be." I knew then it was time to go back to Boise, not just to tell them, but to finally face what I had been running from all my life. "I should come with you," Miles offered as I packed. I shook my head. "No. They need to hear this from me, not from anyone else. If you're there, they'll think you're the reason." He studied me for a long moment, eyes filled with both worry and faith. "I'll wait in Chicago. If you call, I'll come." I smiled, trying to hide the tremor in my chest. I didn't know then that this trip home wouldn't just decide the fate of my relationship with my parents, it would be the last time I ever crossed that threshold as their daughter. I took the morning flight from Boston to Boise in mid-May. The snow had melted, but the air still carried a lingering chill. The plane descended through gray clouds, and I looked down at the town that was both familiar and frightening, the place that had raised me and broken me. The same winding Snake River, the same quiet streets, everything looked unchanged. Only I had changed. In my handbag, I carried what I called my evidence of stability, a kind of self-prepared legal brief, as if I were going to court rather than going home. Inside were copies of my employment contract with the law firm in Chicago, a draft of the wedding invitation, an ultrasound photo, a picture of me receiving my diploma, and the formal letter from Harvard Law. Every page, every word, was my defense proof that I hadn't made a mistake, that I was simply choosing a different kind of life. On the flight home, I sat staring at my laptop screen, editing every slide of a PowerPoint presentation I had titled Moving Forward. I added bullet points like projected income, childcare plan, support network from the Kingston family. I imagined my parents sitting across from me, reviewing each slide, nodding, realizing their daughter didn't need saving, just acceptance. If I show them logic and evidence, they'll understand, I told myself. What I forgot was that my parents had never listened with their hearts. They only listened to what made them proud or what threatened their pride. When the plane touched down, my hands were trembling slightly. I turned on my phone, no messages. I typed a short text, "Just landed. I'd love to have dinner with you tonight." 10 minutes later, my mother replied, "Fine, 6:30. Your father's grilling. Dress neatly, the neighbors might stop by." That last line made me laugh bitterly. 6 years away, and her first concern was still the neighbors. I rented a car and drove along Interstate 84, the familiar stretch lined with potato fields and lonely gas stations. I stopped at a roadside diner and caught my reflection in the restroom mirror. Beneath the long coat, my belly was beginning to show. I fixed my hair and applied a little makeup, not to look pretty, but to look credible. The lawyer in me wanted to prepare for every reaction, every question, every glance. But the daughter in me only longed to hear one thing, even once. "You've been through so much. Welcome home." But as soon as the rental car turned down that old familiar street, I knew I was wrong. The front yard was strung with lights, the kind used for block parties. A handwritten banner hung across the porch. "Welcome home, Clara, Harvard Law graduate." The smell of barbecue drifted through the air, mingling with the sound of neighbors chatting and laughing. I parked at the edge of the driveway, my heart pounding. Everything was staged, a perfect little play about the model family. And I, carrying my quiet secret, was about to become the first crack in their flawless performance. As I stepped out of the car, a few neighbors turned and waved, and my mother came out through the front door, her smile bright, but it froze within a second. Her eyes stopped at the coat that no longer hung quite right over my belly. The air shifted. The smile vanished. I could even hear the faint clatter of cutlery falling inside the house. "Clara," she said, her voice cracking in the middle of my name. Are you pregnant? Before I could answer, my father emerged from the dining room, a beer still in his hand. He looked at me once, then down at my stomach, then back up again. His face went through 3 shades pale, flushed, then dark purple before something in him snapped. She's pregnant, he declared flatly, as if delivering a sentence. Then his hand came down on the table with a crash, the glass shattering in his grip. You've disgraced the Bennett name. His voice was so loud that the neighbor's child nearby started crying. People tried to pretend they hadn't heard, but I saw them faces half hidden behind fences, eyes wide with curiosity. My mother rushed over, grabbing his arm. Douglas, not in front of everyone, she hissed. But she couldn't hide the fury or the shame twisting her face. She turned toward me, voice sharp enough to cut through bone. You made your choice. You chose failure, so go live with it. Get out before anyone else sees you like this. I stood there, motionless in their storm. The air felt thick, like it was absorbing every sound. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my heart slamming against my ribs. And yet, somehow, my voice came out calm, almost gentle. Dad, Mom. I'm not a failure. I just chose love over fear. Maybe they didn't hear me, or maybe they refused to. My mother had already turned her back. My father pointed toward the door, his voice a growl. Get out of my house. I looked around the familiar room, the family photos, the framed certificates that once hung with pride along the walls, now reduced to relics of a story they no longer wanted to tell. My eyes stopped on a picture from my high school graduation, my father standing beside me, his hand on my shoulder, smiling wide. Back then, I thought that smile was for me. Now I knew it was for the medal he could brag about. I walked slowly toward the dining table, where smoke from the barbecue still drifted upward. I don't need a party, I said quietly, meeting their eyes. I don't need to be celebrated. I just wanted to tell you that I'm okay. I have a job. I have someone who loves me. And soon, I'll have a child of my own. My father let out a sharp, mocking laugh, a sound so dry it almost echoed. Someone who loves you? What kind of man gets a woman pregnant before marriage? You went to Harvard for this? To make a fool of yourself? I bit my lip, trying to steady my voice. He's a good man. I just wanted to tell you everything. I don't want to hear it, he roared, his hand trembling around the beer glass he still held. You've dragged my name through the dirt. From this day on, I don't have a daughter named Clara. Get out! My mother stayed silent, tears pooling in her eyes, though she turned away. Her voice trembled. Douglas, please, stop. Then she looked back at me, fear and anger flickering in her gaze. Clara, please, just go. Don't make your father any angrier. I stared at them, feeling something inside me fracture beyond repair. It was like dying a second time, not in body, but in belonging. All the words I had prepared, all the evidence of stability I had carefully packed in that folder, suddenly felt absurd. I had thought logic could save me. But in this house, logic had no place, only pride, and the fear of gossip. I bent down to pick up my suitcase, carefully placing my Harvard diploma on top. Dad, Mom, I said, my voice low but steady. I'm leaving. But I hope that one day, when you look back, you'll realize the honor you're protecting tonight can't keep you warm like the love you're throwing away. No one answered. My father turned his back, opened the fridge, and grabbed another beer. My mother stood still, tears dripping silently onto the floor, but she didn't move toward me. I opened the door and stepped outside. The sunset had painted the yard a deep shade of red. The decorative lights still twinkled, their soft gold reflections flickering through my hair. Behind me, the door slammed shut, a final punctuation mark to a chapter of my life. I pulled my suitcase along the gravel path, the wheels scraping against the stones in the heavy silence. Neighbors avoided my eyes, pretending to chat about nothing as I passed. I knew they'd retell this story tomorrow morning, each one adding their own flavor, their own judgment. But I didn't care anymore. At the end of the street, I turned back one last time. Through the window, I could see my father sitting at the table, his head in his hand, and my mother with her face buried in silence. That house had once been my dream of belonging. Now, it was only a shell, bright, polished, but empty inside. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the suitcase handle, and kept walking. In my head, Miles's words echoed softly. Sometimes, the right path isn't the easy one. Oh. I didn't know where I was going that night. But I knew one thing for sure: I would never return as someone begging to be let in again. Rain began to fall as I left the city limits of Boise. It wasn't heavy, just a slow, cold drizzle, as if the sky was grieving for me. I drove for 2 hours without turning on the radio, without speaking, just listening to the rhythmic swish of the wipers beating against the windshield, a lonely metronome to my solitude. Near the Oregon border, the fuel light turned red. I pulled into a small gas station in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dark fields, lit only by a flickering neon sign and the steady patter of rain on the tin roof. I turned off the engine and sat there, motionless, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. No home. Nowhere to go. And on the back seat, my Harvard diploma lay under the dim light, looking less like an achievement and more like a cruel joke. I took out my phone. On the screen, Miles Kingston's name glowed like a lifeline cutting through the dark, rainy night. I hesitated for a few seconds before pressing call. His voice came through on the first ring, deep, steady, but edged with worry. "Where are you, Clara?" I looked out the window, watching the rain streak down in long, silvery lines under the harsh neon light like tears sliding across glass. "Somewhere between disappointment and Idaho," I said softly, half a joke, half a confession. I heard him inhale sharply on the other end, then silence. Finally, his voice returned, low and certain. "Don't move, I'm coming to get you." I let out a weary laugh. "Miles, you don't have to. It's a long drive. I just need to rest for a bit." But, he interrupted, firm and unwavering. "I didn't ask if you needed me. I'm already on my way." Time seemed to stretch after that. I sat in the car, watching the dashboard clock tick forward minute by minute. The rain grew heavier, the station emptied out, the world around me shrinking to the hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft rhythm of raindrops on the windshield. I pulled my coat tighter and rested a hand on my stomach. The baby kicked lightly, a small flutter, a reminder that I wasn't truly alone. "We're okay, right?" I whispered. And then, for the first time that day, I let myself cry. Not because I had been rejected, but because I finally admitted how much I still wanted to be loved, without condition, without performance, without fear. The sound of an engine broke the stillness. Headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the slick pavement like a stage. A black SUV pulled into the lot, tires splashing against puddles. The door swung open, and there he was, drenched in rain, exhaustion written across his face, but his eyes burning with resolve. He didn't say a word. He just walked straight toward me and wrapped me in his arms, holding me as if letting go would make me disappear. His warmth seeped through my soaked coat, and I shivered, not from cold, but from relief. "I told you," he whispered against my ear. "I'd come." We sat in my car for a while, listening to the rain drum against the roof, a rhythm that felt like an old, familiar song. Miles unscrewed the lid of his thermos and handed me a cup of hot cocoa. "I keep this in the car," he said softly, "for when you decide to be stubborn." I let out a hoarse laugh. "You really know how to prepare." He shook his head, eyes fixed on the rain outside. "No, Clara. I just know you always choose to face things alone. This time, I'm not letting you." By dawn, the rain had started to ease. We moved my things into his car. He placed my suitcase gently in the trunk, wrapping my Harvard diploma in his jacket as though it were the only thing in the world that still needed protecting. "I'm taking you home," he said. "To Chicago?" He nodded. "To the Kingston Foundation, where I work and where you can start over." I looked at him, the dark circles under his eyes from driving all night, the quiet steadiness in his face, and for the first time, I didn't just see the man I loved, I saw the man I trusted. As we pulled out of the station, the morning light began to spill over the mountains, soft and pale. I rested my head against the window, watching the sky shift colors. The world seemed to be turning slowly, gently, as if giving me permission to breathe again. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything. I just wanted peace for myself, for the child growing inside me. We reached Chicago around noon. The city was loud, alive, a jarring contrast to Boise's silence. Miles drove us to a house near Lake Michigan, with black roof tiles and wide windows that caught the light. The Kingston home sat in the quiet suburbs, along a street shaded by old oak trees. As the iron gates swung open, I felt as though I was stepping into another world, one that was still, solid, free of cold words or sharp judgment. When the car stopped, Miles turned to me and took my hand. His eyes were gentle, but steady. "My parents are inside," he said. "They already know everything. You don't have to explain a thing, Clara." I nodded, though my chest tightened. I wasn't afraid of their disapproval, only of pity. I'd spent my whole life under that look, and I never wanted to see it again. The door opened before we could even ring the bell. A tall woman, maybe in her early 50s, with prematurely silver hair and a face that still glowed with warmth, stepped forward with a smile that felt like sunlight. "You must be Clara, right?" she said, and before I could answer, she opened her arms and pulled me into an embrace. The warmth of her body stopped me cold. It had been so long since anyone had held me without ceremony, without posing for a photo, without pride as the reason. "Welcome home," she whispered, her voice husky but soft. I couldn't manage more than 2 words. "Thank you." Behind her stood a tall man, older, with silver-streaked hair and bright gray eyes that were calm but not cold. He stepped forward, extending his hand with quiet confidence. "Gregory Kingston," he said, giving my hand a firm but gentle shake. "Miles's father. And this," he nodded toward the woman beside him, "is Diane, his mother. We've been waiting for you, Clara." I looked up at them, startled. "Waiting? For me?" Diane laughed softly, her eyes shimmering. "Miles has been talking about you for 3 years, dear. Every time he mentions your name, his voice changes, part admiration, part pride. Truth is, we've known about you two for quite a while." I turned toward Miles. He just smiled faintly and said, "Told you, they already know." I pressed my lips together, tears stinging my eyes, though I didn't even know why. Maybe because, for the first time, I didn't have to hide, I didn't have to prove anything. Diane placed a gentle hand on my shoulder and said softly, "You're not just carrying a child, Clara, you're carrying hope. And hope is never a sin." My composure broke, my head dropped, and the tears came fast, unstoppable, unashamed. She wrapped an arm around me, leading me inside without another question, without judgment. "Come in, sweetheart," she murmured. "You must be freezing. Chicago winds can be cruel." The house was simple yet warm, filled with oil paintings, shelves of well-worn books, and the gentle scent of wood, cinnamon, and something freshly baked. There was no trace of showy wealth here, only comfort, the kind that wrapped around you like a blanket you didn't know you needed. On the coffee table sat a steaming cup of tea, already waiting. "You like chamomile, don't you?" Miles told me, Diane said as she placed it before me. I smiled faintly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, thank you." She pressed her lips together in a tender smile, her tone so warm it nearly undid me again. "Call me Mom, Clara, if you want to. In this house, we don't use formalities when we talk about family." Gregory settled into the chair across from me, leaning forward slightly. "We don't need to know what happened back in Boise," he said. "Who said what, who turned away? The only thing that matters is that you're safe and that you're loved. We know how strong you had to be make it here." I bit my lip, clutching the teacup between my palms. I had once imagined a conversation like this with my own parents, countless times, but it had never come. Not once. And now, a man who had been a stranger only hours ago was speaking to me in the calm, compassionate tone I'd spent a lifetime yearning to hear. That afternoon, Diane took me for a walk through the garden behind the house. The smell of wet grass and damp soil after the rain carried a peace I hadn't felt in years. She told me stories about when she was pregnant with Miles, her fears, her joys, her mistakes. "I used to think I had to be perfect to be a good mother," she said quietly. "But I learned something: love doesn't need proof. It only needs to be given." How? Her words hung in the air, soft but weighty like a melody I'd known all along, yet had never dared to sing. That evening, we all had dinner together. There were no questions about my parents, no sidelong glances about the pregnancy before marriage. Only simple, human ones. "Would you like some more? Are you feeling tired? Which room would you like to stay in?" Those small, ordinary things moved me more than any grand words ever could. When I went up to my room, I found a vase of lavender on the desk, the flower I'd once told Miles I loved most, and a small card beside it that read, "Welcome home." I sat down on the edge of the bed, the warm yellow light falling softly over my slightly rounded back. In the mirror, I saw a woman I barely recognized, still me, but not the version who carried herself like a performance. This woman didn't need to prove her worth anymore. I placed a hand on my belly and whispered, "We found home, didn't we?" That night, for the first time in years, I slept without fear, without worrying that a phone call might wake me to ask, "Have you embarrassed us again?" Here, I didn't have to prove anything. Here, I was allowed to simply exist. A week later, Boise began to buzz like a marketplace. In small towns like mine, gossip traveled faster than wind. Word spread that the daughter of Douglas Bennett, the strict, respectable manager of Kingston & Co., had been disowned by her parents but was now living in the mansion of the company's owner. The story rolled from the cafe at the corner, to the cathedral steps, to the Saturday farmers market. With each retelling, it grew new, sharper edges. Some said I was a kept mistress. Others whispered that I had trapped the Kingston heir. The Bennett name, once spoken with pride, became the town's favorite scandal. And for my father, Douglas Bennett, whose reputation mattered more to him than even his dignity, those whispers were a fatal wound. I found out the next morning when Diane walked into my room, holding a printed copy of a local newspaper she'd found online. On the front page was a grainy article loaded with insinuations. An internal source reports that the daughter of a longtime Kingston & Co. manager is currently residing at the company chairman's home, stirring public curiosity. I read it in silence. Diane watched me carefully, her voice soft but steady. "You don't have to care about what they say, Clara. The people who need to know the truth, they'll see it for themselves." I nodded, but my chest ached. Every word in that article cut like a reopened wound, a reminder that no matter how far I'd come, I was still the daughter of two people who would rather abandon me than face the world's judgment. Back in Idaho, the storm was only beginning. On Monday morning, when Douglas walked into the Kingston & Co. office, the room fell silent. No one spoke, but the air was thick, heavy with the kind of quiet that screamed louder than words. By mid-morning, the phone on his desk rang. It was a call from the company's Chicago headquarters. Human Resources requested his immediate presence in a meeting with the board of directors regarding a personal matter affecting the company's public image. He froze. When it dawned on him that the rumor had reached Gregory Kingston himself, the company's chairman, the ground beneath him began to crumble. He called my mother, Janet, his voice trembling. "They know. It's over. Pack your things. We're flying to Chicago." That night, while Miles and I were having dinner with his parents, Gregory's phone rang. He listened quietly, then sighed and gave a faint, tired smile. "Douglas and his wife will be here tomorrow morning," he said, his eyes finding mine. I froze, my fork halfway to my plate. "They want to see me?" "No," he said gently. "They want to see me, but sooner or later, we'll all have to sit down together." I said nothing. Inside me, I couldn't tell whether the feeling rising in my chest was fear or relief. Gregory Kingston decided to invite the Bennetts over for dinner. He called it a civilized conversation between adults, but there was something else in his eyes, a cool composure that only comes from someone who's seen through too many kinds of pretense. I didn't object, though every part of me was torn. One part wanted to avoid them forever. The other needed to look them in the eye to see whether there was anything left of parents in them, or if all that remained was the fear of losing their reputation. The dining room was set in quiet elegance, the large window overlooking the garden. Candlelight flickered against crystal glasses, and the air smelled faintly of grilled meat and wine. Gregory had a way of arranging things so that the atmosphere itself demanded honesty, leaving no space for performance. Diane sat across from me, her hand resting gently on the table. "Let them reveal themselves," she murmured. They arrived 10 minutes early. I heard the car stop at the gate, the rhythmic knock on the front door, 3 measured taps. When the butler opened it, I saw my parents step inside, looking like people who had rehearsed all night for a scene called Remorse. My father wore a dark navy suit, his tie pulled so tight it had flushed his neck red. My mother wore an old floral dress and clutched a box of cookies, the same kind she always used as social currency. Her smile was brittle, stretched too thin, and the first thing she said was, "What a beautiful home, Mrs. Kingston. I remember seeing it in the paper once." Diane smiled politely, replying with quiet precision, "Thank you, but tonight, we don't need to talk about architecture." We took our seats. The silence that followed was delicate, like a thread stretched between us, waiting for the wrong word to snap it. Gregory was the first to speak. "I invited you here not to create conflict, but to give everyone the chance to say what needs to be said honestly and directly." My father nodded quickly, his voice too eager. Of course, we sincerely apologize for all the misunderstandings. We had no idea who the father of the child was. If we had known, things would have been very different." I set my fork down and lifted my head. "Now you know," I said quietly, my voice low and even. The room stilled, not silent, but suspended. My father gave a strained smile. "Yes, now we know. And truly, we're happy for you." "Really, we are. It was all just a moment of temper." Diane placed her glass on the table, her tone soft as air but sharp enough to slice through the space between us. "And if the father hadn't been Miles," she asked, "what then? Would you still have thrown her out?" No one answered. My mother lowered her gaze, her hands twisting the napkin in her lap. My father dabbed sweat from his forehead, his voice faltering. We were only worried for her. In a small town, people talk. I didn't want Clara to face the shame of gossip." Gregory leaned forward, resting an arm on the table, his eyes cold but steady. "Honor doesn't live in what people say about you, Douglas. It lives in how you treat your child when no one's watching." My father's smile twitched and collapsed. Sweat darkened his collar. "I understand. I truly do. I've lost sleep over it." "No," I interrupted, my voice rough, trembling from the effort to stay calm. "You didn't lose sleep because you regretted anything. You lost sleep because you were afraid. Afraid of embarrassment. Afraid people would say you couldn't control your daughter. And Mom." I turned to her, my throat tight. "You were afraid of the neighbors, but neither of you was ever afraid of losing me." My mother looked up, eyes brimming. "Don't say that, Clara. You have no idea how much pain we've felt." Diane's voice cut in, quiet but cold. "Pain?" she said. "It's fascinating how easily people call it pain after they've thrown their pregnant daughter out into the street." "Vi." Gregory poured another measure of wine, his voice steady, low, and deliberate. "Douglas," he said, "I know you've worked for Kingston & Co. for 17 years. I respect honest labor. But what you did that night, throwing your daughter out because you feared the talk of others, tells me one thing. When forced to choose between morality and reputation, you chose reputation." My father suddenly stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the cold marble floor. His fists clenched at his sides, his voice trembling, the sound of a man watching his entire world slip away. "Please, just give me 1 minute," he said, his voice breaking. No one spoke. Diane glanced at Gregory. He gave a small nod. I stayed seated, eyes fixed on the man who had once towered over me like a mountain, now shrunken, shaking, a shadow of himself. He took a hesitant step forward, fear and desperation tangled in his gaze. "Clara," he whispered. I know I was wrong. I shouldn't have sent you away. I was scared. I lifted my head, meeting his eyes. What were you scared of? He didn't hesitate. I was afraid of what people would say, afraid they'd think I failed as a father. Afraid that everything I worked for, my entire reputation, would crumble over one mistake. I pressed my lips together, tears stinging my eyes, but my voice stayed calm, painfully calm. No, I said quietly. You weren't afraid of what they'd say. You were afraid of losing face, of cracking the image you built by sacrificing everyone around you. You were never afraid of losing me, were you? My father froze, color draining from his face, his shoulders trembling. Behind him, I heard my mother's stifled sob, then the sudden sound of fabric brushing the floor. She had fallen to her knees, clutching the hem of my dress. Clara, please, she cried. Forgive me. I was just so scared people would laugh at us. I didn't mean to, Her voice broke. I looked down at the woman who had brought me into the world, who once taught me to stand tall before anyone, now kneeling, small and shattered. A part of me wanted to reach out, to pull her up. But my hands wouldn't move. Mom, I said slowly. I understand your fear, but there's one thing you never understood about mine. He took a shaky breath. I was afraid of being alone. 100 times more than you were afraid of shame. And both of you made sure I learned what loneliness really feels like. My mother broke into sobs, her head bowed low. My father tried to help her up, but Diane gently placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "Let her finish." I drew in a deep breath and turned toward them. "I'm not cutting you off," I said, each word deliberate and steady. "But I need peace. I want my child to grow up knowing that love is not conditional, that family is not a place that makes you feel ashamed just for existing. I will not let this baby grow up having to ask permission to be loved the way I once did." Gregory stood beside me, his expression heavy but fair. Folding his arms, he spoke in a low, measured tone. "Douglas, I'll keep your position at Kingston & Co. Not out of pity, but because I believe people can learn something after they lose their pride. Die." He stepped closer until he was standing right in front of my father, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "But, hear me clearly. If you ever use this connection with Miles, with Clara, with my family to seek advantage or manipulate the company's name, your desk will be empty by tomorrow morning. Do I make myself clear?" My father nodded again and again, sweat beading across his forehead. "Yes, I understand. I swear, I understand." Good," Gregory said simply, turning away. "Then you have a chance to make things right. But that doesn't mean you get to forget what you did wrong." My mother looked up, eyes red and swollen. "Clara, you're not coming back to Idaho, are you?" I met her gaze, my voice soft but unwavering. "No, Mom, home is where I feel safe. And there, I only ever felt afraid. If you and Dad truly want to see your grandchild one day, I won't stop you. But don't come out of shame or guilt." I paused, letting the words land. "Come because you want to love them." The room fell into silence. Only the ticking of the clock and the soft patter of rain on the roof broke the stillness. My mother lowered her head, tears slipping quietly onto the carpet. My father took her hand and spoke in a voice so small it almost sounded like confession. "We'll try to learn how to be parents again." I looked at them for a long time before nodding once. I didn't know if I believed them. But for the first time, they weren't talking about neighbors, reputation, or the Bennetts. They were talking about themselves. Gregory ended the evening with a single sentence. "We're done here." He motioned to the butler. Chairs shifted softly, glasses clinked as they were gathered, quiet sounds that somehow felt heavy. Douglas and Janet rose from their seats, murmured polite thanks, and walked slowly toward the door. As they passed me, my father stopped, his voice raw. "Clara, whether you believe it or not, I'm proud of you." I met his eyes, no anger left, only exhaustion. "You don't need to be proud," I said quietly. "Just learn to be kind." The door closed behind them with a muted thud, sealing the night in stillness. I sank into my chair, the tension draining from my body. It felt as if a mountain I'd carried for years had finally rolled off my shoulders. Diane came over and rested a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You did well, Clara. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means you've stopped letting them control your pain." I nodded, my throat burning, eyes wet. Miles sat beside me, took my hand firmly in his, and said only one sentence, quiet, certain. "We're okay now." Outside, rain fell in a steady rhythm across the yard. Through the window, I watched their car lights disappear down the oak-lined road. The tire tracks they left were already fading under the rain as if they had never been here at all. Inside me rose a feeling I couldn't name, not joy, not sorrow, but a deep, clean stillness. Maybe that's what freedom feels like. That dinner ended without goodbyes, without hugs, without tears of reconciliation. Only silence, a silence heavier than grief, yet necessary to close a chapter. And I knew, in that moment, I was no longer the daughter of fear and expectation. I had become myself, a woman ready to begin again, not by proving her worth, but simply by living. 3 months later, the bar exam results were released. I had passed. Not just passed, I was in the top 10% of the entire state. When the email came through, I didn't scream, didn't jump around like my classmates. I just sat there, motionless, as tears slipped down onto the keyboard. Not tears of happiness, but of quiet release, because I knew, finally, I had walked through the storm without needing anyone's permission to survive. Miles came into the room holding a cup of coffee. He stopped when he saw my tears. "Good news or bad?" he asked. I laughed softly through them. "Good, I did it." He said nothing, just leaned down and kissed my forehead. "I never doubted you, Clara." I began working for a nonprofit organization that defended the rights of women discriminated against for being pregnant women who had faced the same kind of rejection I once did. There were days I would sit for hours listening to their stories. A secretary fired after her boss discovered her pregnancy. A college student disowned by her family for bringing shame to the name. Each time I finished writing a petition on their behalf, I felt something in me grow lighter, as if, by helping them find justice, I was quietly healing myself too. Our wedding took place that fall, in the garden behind the Kingston home. No extravagant gown, no grand guest list, just a handful of people we loved, and lavender blooming softly under the golden sunlight. Diane arranged every bouquet herself, and Gregory officiated the ceremony. When he took my hand and placed it into Miles's, his voice was deep and warm as he said, "Marriage isn't the union of two families, it's the commitment of two souls who are grateful to walk the same path." After the ceremony, Diane pulled me into her arms and whispered, "Family isn't where you're born, it's where you're accepted." I'd heard many beautiful words in my life, but none had ever healed me as deeply as those. A few weeks after the wedding, an unexpected letter arrived from Idaho. The handwriting, slanted and careful, was unmistakably Evan's, my brother's. "Clara, I heard people say you're working in Chicago helping women who've faced discrimination. I don't really know what to say. But you've done what I never had the courage to do, to live honestly, even when it costs you everything. I'm proud of you." I read it over and over, each line like a quiet, steady breath. I smiled through tears, realizing that the bitterness in my heart had finally dissolved. What remained was peace, the kind that comes when you understand that no one can take away your dignity unless you let them. That evening, I sat on the porch of the Kingston home, watching the city lights ripple across the lake. Miles sat beside me, his hand resting gently over mine as it cradled my growing belly. "Who do you think the baby will take after?" he asked. I smiled. "I hope they have your courage, and a heart soft enough to forgive." He squeezed my hand and murmured, "If they're anything like you, that's enough." And in that moment, I knew the wounds had begun to heal. Not because time had passed, but because I had finally found people who loved me the right way. A year later, our small apartment in Chicago was flooded with morning light. I sat by the window holding our son, Noah, watching the trees in the park below turn gold with autumn. From the kitchen came the sound of Miles's laughter, mingling with the smell of coffee and fresh pastries. Life wasn't perfect, but it was full, in ways I had never dared to dream. I still worked at the nonprofit for women's rights, and on weekends, I taught a course at the University of Chicago called Ethics of Compassion. Every time I walked into that classroom and saw those bright, curious faces so much like my own years ago, I felt a quiet sense of purpose. I taught them about law, about justice, and about the one truth no textbook ever explains. Sometimes, compassion is the most powerful act of law there is. Den. When Noah turned 6 months old, I was invited to speak on a talk show about women and social prejudice. The host looked at me and asked, "You were once rejected by your own family. How did you overcome that?" I smiled, met the camera's gaze, and said slowly but firmly, "When I was thrown out of my home, I thought I'd lost everything. But in truth, I only lost the people who didn't deserve to keep me." The studio fell silent. Then, a few people in the audience rose to their feet and began to applaud. In that moment, I no longer saw myself as the girl who had been broken but as the woman who had turned her pain into power. That night, the program aired across the state. In Idaho, Evan sent me a text. "Sis, Mom watched it," she cried. I replied, "Tell her not to cry, tell her daughter is okay." That weekend, the Kingston family gathered for dinner. Gregory held Noah in his arms, the baby gripping his finger and laughing in pure delight. Diane set the table with quiet joy, while Miles stood beside her, occasionally leaning down to kiss our son's cheek. I sat back, watching them, warmth flooding through me like sunlight slipping through the white curtains. Gregory looked up with a smile. "He looks just like you, Clara." I chuckled softly. "I just hope he never has to learn how to be loved the way I did." "Ah." Diane placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, her voice tender and certain. "He won't. He'll grow up in love, not in fear." As night fell, I stepped out onto the balcony and looked over the city stretched wide beneath the lights. Each building, each street shimmered like a quiet retelling of my own journey from the girl cast out of her home to the woman who chose her own life. Miles came up behind me, wrapping his arms gently around my shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Still staring at the skyline, I whispered, "I'm thinking, they chose pride, and I chose compassion." He smiled, pulled me closer, and kissed my forehead. "And that," he said softly, "is why you won." Behind us, Diane and Gregory were rocking Noah in their arms, their laughter carrying across the patio like music. In that moment, I understood something simple and final: true victory isn't making others regret what they did. It's refusing to let old pain decide who you become. I had lost one family, but I had found another. A family that didn't need to be perfect, only real. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. The wind off Lake Michigan brushed against my face, cool and kind. Inside me, there was no more anger, no regret, only a still, quiet peace I had once thought impossible. That night, as Noah slept soundly in my arms, I opened my notebook and began the first line of my new book. Freedom isn't about leaving the place that hurt you. It's about no longer letting that pain shape the path ahead. Outside the window, Chicago still shimmered, a city of light standing as a quiet reminder to everyone listening to this story. Sometimes, life forces us to leave the place we once called home in order to find ourselves again. Being rejected doesn't mean you're worthless. It simply proves that you are strong enough to no longer depend on the wrong kind of approval. Remember this. You are not defined by your past, nor by how others see you, but by how you rise after being broken. Like Clara, you may lose one family, but you can always find another one that loves you for who you truly are. So, if today you feel lonely, know this. You are not lost, you're simply on your way back to yourself. Thank you for listening to today's story. If you felt seen, understood, or found a piece of yourself in Clara's journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to help spread stories of courage, healing, and inner strength. See you in the next story, where every wound has the power to become its own light.